Before we get into the bulk of the tier list itself, it's important to note that, as with any tier list, the visual can only represent a single dimension of information for a single person. Based on skill, difficulty, and team composition, your experience with each weapon may differ. That being said, this tier list roughly reflects the general attitudes of quite a few of the best players I know, as well as my own opinions, and roughly mirrors their pick rates in modded play. Speaking of which, this tier list will be heavily influenced by modded play, specifically Hazard 6 with doubled enemy spawns and upwards. Given if we were purely talking about vanilla play, the tier list would look something like this. Given the modded focus, there are a couple things to note. Generalists are far less valued. Team play is emphasized, so if a weapon fills a niche that is done far better by another weapon, it will often end up largely perfunctory. Secondly, fire-based weapons are likely overrepresented. They scale extremely well with enemy density due to heat spread, a mechanic where enemies that are on fire spread heat to nearby enemies, and complement Volatile Bullet's Bulldog, one of the strongest weapons in the game. Nevertheless, if a placement or recommendation works in this difficulty, it will work in yours. Builds I consider meta for each weapon will be starred, and I will only go over builds that I consider notably strong. I've also separated some specific overclocks, which are singularly outstanding options that function off a gimmick entirely divorced from what the gun normally does. Builds where I take a mod over ammo can usually be swapped out for ammo if you're really struggling, but if I take ammo over something else, you'll almost always want to as well. Without further ado, let's get into the tier list. We'll start with the CRSPR Flamethrower. Build it with 23221 without overclocks or with fuel stream diffusion for a generalist brawling weapon, or 23232 sticky fuel for the arguable single most potent holding and crowd clear tool in the game. Given what I just said about fires in effect, this should come as no surprise. Letting enemies on fire and slowing them massively with Tier 3B sticky flame slowdown enables some truly ludicrous horde clear and ammo efficiency. The long duration of sticky fuel, in the hands of a competent driller, can mean an entirely grunt and swarmer free game for the rest of the team. A top tier weapon and easily best in its slot. The flamethrower's polar opposite is the Cryo Cannon, which runs 11132 without overclocks and with Snowball, Ice Spear, or improved thermal efficiency. Ice Storm with 12x32 or 11112, depending on if you want sustain or damage respectively, is a decent option for solo or pubs. Cryo is unfortunately a much weaker weapon. The ice trails it leaves are weak and short-lasting, making this weapon require near constant M1 holding by the driller, and even when it does freeze, it just leaves behind chores for the team to kill. The frozen status is powerful, but simultaneously volatile, as any teammates with even a hint of heat can ruin Cryo's only real advantage over fire, which is dealing with big enemies. Cryo is better at dealing with Mactera and breeders, but freezing them with any sort of ammo efficiency requires quite dangerously running at them for cold radiance. Given all these factors, Cryo is decent, but unfortunately just usable compared to Driller's other tools. The last of the Driller primaries is the Corrosive Sludge Pump. Run it with 13212 Volatile Impact Mixture for insane burst, or 12222 without overclocks or with Disperser Compound. The Sludge Pump occupies a sort of happy medium between the other two options. It retains very decent effectiveness and has a very low attention cost versus both grunts and larger enemies, but exchanges that for much higher difficulty of puddle placement and worse swarmer clear. This weapon loses a lot of effectiveness if the terrain is highly uneven, but nonetheless is quite potent in a variety of situations. It loses some points for not comboing with volatile bullets, but all in all is a strong alternative to the flamethrower. Moving on to driller secondaries now, we have the Subata 120. Run it with 21211 with no overclock or full auto as a combo weapon for CRSPR, or 213XX with explosive reload for generalist damage. Where do I even start with this thing? Pitiful damage, low rate of fire, minuscule magazine size, and worst of all, it's semi-automatic. The one full auto mod it does have ratchets up the recoil so much it becomes largely worthless at the longer ranges, which is the literal only niche it has in comparison to the other driller secondaries. Explosive reload grants it decent damage, but still not enough to be anything worthwhile. Subata is arguably the weakest weapon in the entire game, and falls solidly into the bottom of the usable category. This is in stark contrast to the experimental plasma charger. Run it with 21222 overclockless, with energy rerouting, or with persistent plasma. Heavy hitter with 11222 is also a fine option if you're bringing cryo. This thing is an absolute beast, simply by virtue of its tier 5 upgraded thin containment field. A 240 damage AoE ball of death for a measly 9 ammo is truly ridiculous numbers, providing Driller insane single target damage, which pairs well with the relatively low single target damage of the Flamethrower, and amazing anti-Mactera utility. With persistent plasma, it is also some of the best nadicite and shredder clear in the game. On top of that, it even mines minerals for you, easily best in slot with really no debate. Finally for Driller, we have the Colette Wave Cooker. The builds for this thing are very varied and diverse, so I'll point you towards Lazy Maybe's excellent Wave Cooker build breakdown, linked in the description and the top left. However, one thing is shared across all of them: they're not very good. The Wave Cooker essentially only augments Driller's wave clear, which is not at all productive given how powerful it already is. It provides okay single target and convenient nadicite clear, but is generally a win more overclock rather than one that actually provides value. It's usable, but just not all that great. Moving on to the engineer now, we'll start with the Warthog Auto 210, which runs 12321 with or without every overclock, and all are decent options aside from mini shells, but typically magnetic pellet alignment or stunner are seen as the best. The Warthog is, with turret whip, great at holding fortified positions with huge bursts of 160 AoE damage, and acts as very functional self-defense thanks to its chance to stun on weak point hit, or any hit, given you're running stunner. It can one-shot grunts to the face and deals pretty serviceable Praetorian damage as well. This weapon is a great generalist, and a strong alternative to other engineer primaries. Next is the Stubby Voltaic SMG. Run this with 21222 overclockless or with EM refire as a crowd control option, 1x11x with EM refire for single target, or 21221 turret EM discharge. With most builds, this thing has pretty mediocre power overall. Crowd control options are finicky and not all that effective, and while EM refire is alright single target, it's not amazing compared to other options and has pretty mediocre ammo economy. On top of that, you miss out on any sort of stunner fear. On the other hand, turret EM discharge completely changes the flow of the gun, turning it into an extremely potent area denial tool that can handle even the densest of swarms. Most Stubby builds are just usable, but turret EM discharge is a strong alternative to the Lock 1 Smart Rifle. This gun is heavily dependent on overclocks. Take it with 21111 explosive chemical rounds or 11112 executioner, or don't take it at all if your goal is to maximize effectiveness. These two builds absolutely shred though. Executioner is probably the second most potent single target option in the game, shredding through Praetorians, Oppressors, and Shellbacks like no other gun in the game can. Explosive chemical rounds trades that single target for huge wave clear, giving engineers some of his best self-defense in the primary slot. Both builds are exceptionally flexible at killing Mactera, and one of the team's best options for spitters similarly. The Lock is easily best in slot as far as engineer primaries go. It's time for secondaries. First up is the Deepcore 40mm PGL. You can go the area of effect route with 1113X without overclocks or on any non-unstable overclock, the most powerful of which is RJ250 compound. Alternatively, 21132 for hyperpropellant is a decent single target option, and you can run 21X22 Fatboy if you want to troll. The PGL is unfortunately largely outclassed by NG's other options. Hyperpropellant suffers from ammo economy on a class that has Executioner, and is competing with other team options like Volatile Bullets Bulldog or the Scout's M1000. RJ250 is generally mediocre crowd clear that, while not terrible, is competing with some seriously heavy hitters. While fun, the PGL is unfortunately just usable. Next is the Breach Cutter. Run it with 11122 without overclocks, with lightweight cases, or with Inferno. 23122 Stronger Plasma Current is also a decent option. This gun is pretty insane. It deals enormous burst damage against just about everything really. It cleaves through Mactera swarms, Grunt swarms, Prate swarms, Swarmer swarms, given you take tier 5B. You name it and the Breach Cutter will kill it. Generalists tend to be of lower value in team compositions, but the Breach Cutter is just so generally incredible that it's hard to pass up. With stun, it also serves as engineer's most valuable self-defense tool. To nobody's surprise, I imagine, Breach Cutter is engineer's best in slot secondary. Finally, for the engineer, is the Shard Diffractor. There is only really one build for this that people take in top lobbies, Volatile Impact Reactor, whose mods don't really matter aside from tier 1 ammo and tier 4 heat, though for my money 31111 is its best build. Volatile Impact Reactor is one of the most powerful offensive tools in the game, allowing you to spawn camp like no other weapon. However, it struggles with self-defense, leaving NG vulnerable to harder pushes. Builds like 32113 Feedback Loop or 31211 Overdrive Booster, either of these also work fine without an overclock for AoE and single target respectively, are also decent options, but suffer from ammo economy and are often outclassed by Breach Cutter. Nevertheless, the Shard Diffractor remains a strong alternative option. Getting into gunner builds now, we're starting with his iconic Leadstorm powered minigun. There are some pretty varied ways to build it, but 32323 is a decent generalist default build. On the Leadstorm overclock in modded lobbies, 32113 is usually taken. Bullet Hell takes 3222X with either aggressive venting for solo or hot bullets in a team, and Burning Hell takes X2223 with cooling when you need to shoot a lot of trash and accuracy when you don't. The minigun is an extremely flexible and potent DPS or stun weapon, dealing with a variety of targets at any range with great fidelity. Hot bullets and or Burning Hell enable volatile bullets to great effect, while aggressive venting provides amazing self-defense and horde clear at higher levels of enemy density. The minigun is easily Gunner's best in slot. In stark contrast, we have the Thunderhead Heavy Autocannon. It's run with X212X overclockless or with splintering shells, while Big Bertha takes XX112. I like taking mag size and rate of fire, but on difficulties that care more about ammo economy, ammo and fire rate buildup might be more comfortable. The autocannon really suffers from having a lack of proper crowd control. Its horde DPS is fine, though that's a fairly perfunctory role for Gunner to be filling. However, while you're trying to clear the storm while slowed, they creep up on you continuously, making the gun extremely unsafe to use, even with its mediocre fear mod. On top of that, it's pretty terrible at dealing with anything but swarms due to its low innate accuracy. Pair that with the fact that even disregarding its extremely long reloads, it's often outperformed by the Hurricane even in that niche, and you have a weapon that's really just usable. This is, of course, entirely ignoring the elephant in the room. That overclock. Has 5 Pub Plague and Certified Fun Killer. 22322 Neurotoxin payload is so strong that even modded players refuse to use it. Easily best in slot. Enough said. Next up is the Hurricane Guided Rocket System. I ghostwrote an entire Reddit post about this gun without overclocks and with its cleans, so if you're interested in those builds, they'll be linked in the description. The builds linked also work for Salvo. Outside of its cleans, Hurricane can take 2x212 Jet Fuel Homebrew or 31222 Mine Layer. With its cleans, Hurricane acts as a more crowd clear focused alternative to the minigun that retains competent ignition that doesn't care about heat buildup. With the Jet Fuel Homebrew, it's a good alternative to the Leadstorm, exchanging flexibility and ignition for higher weak point DPS and stun. Mine Layer is a truly ridiculous crowd clear beast which competes for a niche with sticky fuel and, shockingly, sometimes manages to win. The Hurricane is a strong alternative to the minigun, while Mine Layer is arguably best in slot. Moving on to secondaries, we have the Bulldog Heavy Revolver. Run this 22311 overclockless, or with Homebrew or 6-shooter, 23321 Elephant rounds, or 23321 volatile bullets. Without overclocks, the Bulldog is a decent Bacteria and Menace killer with stun utility. With Elephant rounds, it gains a lot of value versus stationaries and high value targets. However, this gun is basically entirely defined by volatile bullets, which in turn can define an entire team composition. Volatile bullets is an absolute single target beast, shredding through stationaries, goobers, menaces, and just generally any high health target with absolute ease. Entire weapons can be defined just by how well they enable volatile bullets. Easily and undeniably a best in slot option. The Bird 7 Burst Fire Gun runs 2322X without overclocks with experimental rounds or lead spray. 3212X electrominelets in solo or pub play is also an option. Burt is kind of a jack of all trades that, like the autocannon, really starts to have issues with performance when stress tested. It's a weapon mostly meant to unload into weak points, but the Bulldog usually performs that job far more flexibly, especially at a range or when you're trying to burst down a specific enemy. Gunner really benefits from having his primary out for a long time, especially on the minigun given its heat mechanics, which the Burt doesn't really enable. Running Burt means you either give up minigun efficiency or are forced to run another primary, which is questionable still since the Hurricane's most potent niche is as an ignition tool for volatile bullets, and the Autocannon is the Autocannon. While this weapon is not terrible, it suffers from a use case issue and ends up only usable as a result. The Armskore Coil Gun largely falls into the same boat, with one notable exception. Run this gun with 222x3 for every build, with triple tech chambers, the Mole, and Hellfire being the most notable overclocks for this gun. With Fear, it's a pretty nice self-defense tool, but is, again, a generalist weapon that doesn't do anything particularly strong. It also tends to take quite a bit of time to use, meaning you lose minigun heat. It's a decent crowd control, but pretty unwieldy crowd clear and worse single target still. It just doesn't really do what Gunner wants from a secondary. Aside from Hellfire, of course, which turns the mediocre Trill into a solid line of absolute death, and has a good case for being the strongest overclock in the game. The Coil Gun is just usable, but Hellfire is best in slot. Finally, we have Scout. First up is the Deepcore GK2, which takes 21222 on Bullets of Mercy or AI Stability Engine. It is, after the recent balance passes, not bad at all. It's decently proficient at doing most of the things Scout wants to do, picking high value targets off, mag dumping into shellbacks and other tanky targets, and is exceptionally safe for dealing with stationaries. Altogether, the GK2 isn't really a bad option. Its main problem is that its competition is really good. Because of that, it lands into the strong side of usable. Speaking of its competition, we're finally at the M1000 Classic. I can make a whole video just as a love letter to this thing. I probably will make that video at some point. It's the perfect gun. Talking about its best builds, it all feels like a disservice. There are so many genuinely competitive options here that it takes several minutes just to go over them. The ones you'll see most in modded play tend to be 23112 or 23121 on hover clock and minimal clips or active stability system, but there are many other options. The M1000 does everything Scout wants it to do, and it does it perfectly. Kitted properly, you instantly delete most high-value targets, demolish stationaries, chunk through tanky enemies, melt shellbacks, and can even crowd clear in a pinch. And it feels so good. If there was ever a best in slot, this would be it. Even putting this in the same tier as these other weapons feels like an injustice. You know what? I'm making an M1000 tier. It's really just that good. As a swift departure from good, we have the Drak 25 Plasma Carbine up next. Run it with X1212 thermal exhaust feedback or 1X312 aggressive venting if you must. It's Scout's crowd clear weapon, but it's really not good. Scout largely shouldn't be focusing on crowd clear at all in the first place, but even if you gimp your team support capabilities by running this gun, you're still bad at crowd clear. Aggressive venting is pretty nice in solo, I will admit, but in team games, bringing the Drak just sacrifices all of Scout's strengths for a bit of convenience. I wish this gun was good, I really do, but it does something Scout neither needs nor wants to do, and it does it badly. Sadly, the Drak is just usable, though thermal exhaust feedback does have a decent niche in team comps in conjunction with crowd bolts as a ranged ignition tool. It's also one of the Drak's strongest crowd clear choices if you really insist on it. And it's finally the last weapon category. Only took 3,000 words of script to get here. We're starting off strong with the jury-rigged Boomstick. Run this with 21313 without overclocks or on any of its cleans, or 11213 with jumbo shells. The Boomstick is a really great and flexible utility tool. Comboed with IFGs and fire spread, it can act as good crowd clear in a pinch. You can unload 2 shots into menaces or other high value targets for a strong stun effect, which is especially useful if you take Fear on that 1000, and a nice burst of damage. It's a very quick ranged ignition tool to enable volatile bullets as well. The Boomstick is sort of a generalist, but in the way that it just generally complements everything the Scout wants to do. It's also incredibly mobile and survivable if you run special powder. Definitely one of Scout's best in slot secondaries. Moving on to the Zhukov NUK17s now. Run this with 13212 cryo minelets or 13232 embedded detonators. I really can't recommend this thing without overclocks, or really even with. At base, it's an extremely mediocre kind of single target damage option. I'm not even sure what exactly this gun is meant to do, to be quite honest. Cryo Minelets and Embedded Detonators push it towards crowd clear / single target extremes, but both lose out on a ton of stun ignition or general utility versus other options available in Scout's secondary slot. Zhukovs also have misleading stats and are bad feeling in general. A usable weapon, but not even close to anything more. And truly finally, we have the Nishanka Boltshark X80. Run it with 1x111 cryo or firebolts. This gun, if you can even call it that, is the utility king. Cryo bolts provide stationary clear equaling or perhaps even surpassing that of volatile bullets Bulldog, as well as providing pretty decent freeze power against ground enemies and menaces. Firebolts, on the other hand, are a crowd clear powerhouse, provided your team is leaving enemies alive, or you have no team. Other builds have their niches too, and all of them can get pheromone bolts, which provide instant access to one of the most busted status effects in the game. Check out my 6x2 Escort True Solo if you're interested in seeing Pharaoh's true potential. Boltshark is a highly competitive best-in-slot option. And there you have it. Here's an uninterrupted glance at the tier list. If you skipped to this point, consider actually watching the video so you learn something. Tier lists are extremely one-dimensional in the information they convey. If you actually watched to this point, thanks. Consider liking and or subscribing to encourage more similar content. If you'd like to debate or ask for more depth in a choice I've made here, I'd be happy to write essays in my comment section. And remember, at the end of the day, this sort of tier list is catered towards people who are looking to push every bit of possible performance out of their builds. You can succeed even on modded hazards with the worst of these. If a weapon you love is in a tier you don't, please just ignore me and continue doing what you have fun doing. Happy mining out there. Rock and stone.